Dad was always tied up. And I heard that so much that I thought somebody, I was so young, I thought somebody had come in and tied him up. He couldn't, we were always headed for trips, and he was never ready to go.
Right.
And then where they parked there was, if you blocked his little entrance into his parking lot, where there's only like about 2 parking places, then you'd always get a ticket. He just got tickets and tickets and tickets there for blocking his own parking lot. But a man came in who Dad had been assigned to make an appraisal because of a power line was going through, and this man didn't want the power line to go through, but it was an eminent domain type thing where it had to go through, and it did touch his land, and he came in and was just furious. "Don't you ever go on my land again?" And he was all just really irate, an old-time farmer and you're never welcome there, and don't do it. And well, Dad didn't have any, he had to do it. It was like an ordered deal for an easement for a power company. And I remember he just looked at the guy and he says, "Well, one thing remember, you're always welcome to come here into the office." And the fellow didn't know what to do, so he just left.
I always felt that Grandpa probably made a lot of money, and had he not had such a large family and not been so generous with helping almost anybody, that he would have been super wealthy. He was probably a financial genius, and maybe really blessed, but I think he gave an awfully lot to people in need, whoever it might be.
And not just that, but big donations to BYU, Rick's.
Big donations, giving land. He told me once that some of his best business deals were things that he got into, and like the Avalon Apartments, and there were old people living there, and he didn't want to raise the rents. It was a real losing proposition to him, but he didn't want to hurt them, and people couldn't pay the rent. He would just say, "That's okay, when you have the money." And then the property would increase in value, and he says that was some of the best deals he ever had. His intent was really just to be helpful, and he probably could have made money earlier or something by selling or kicking the people out, but instead he just let them stay there. If they didn't have the money, it's okay. But he never talked about that. I mean, I'd have to get this in little bits and pieces, because he was just very humble about that and never talked about it. In fact, even at his funeral, I don't think that really came out, and probably that he maybe wouldn't want it to have.
Yeah.
Dad always felt that there was time. He believed that human relations were all important, being respectful was all important, and there was time. And I think mainly it's probably related to age. I would always be pushing, "Let's get this done." Dad was seldom in a hurry, and I'm relating this to mild manners, in that I many times thought, well, these people are busy, they need to get this done, and Dad's answer would always be, "No, it's more important to them that we treat them with respect, and we enjoy the relationship, and we have we take time to make sure it's right."
He was just really a hard worker. He would get up at 6 in the morning and meet with the Forest Service people, and then drive into the courthouses and the real estate offices and talk to the landowners. And he was just really determined to get as much done, during that week, and all of the background work, and then at night I would just be tired from driving and doing everything, because we were up at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and he would just keep working till 9:30 or 10 at night. And I remember we'd have a nice motel and stuff like that, and I'd want to watch TV or do something, and Dad would just keep going till like 9 or 10 at night, you know, and then it would start. So he knew how to work.
Dad, at one time, a lot of people don't realize this, he actually left our business. John was involved in it, and I think Dick by that time, and actually managed a savings and loan in Idaho Falls. I remember one of the associates, and somebody who respected Dad, brought in some money, which at that time would have been a large portion of this man's savings, and asked Dad to deposit it in the savings and loan. And of course, this is what savings and loan was in business for, is collect these deposits and then make loans. But Dad had, through his association with the savings and loan, come to believe that the deposits were not going to be secure. So here's another dilemma. If you accept the deposit, that's going to help the savings and loan. It'll give it more liquidity. That's his employer. But if you are trusted by this individual and the savings and loan fails and this individual loses his money, that would not be right either. And I remember very well, sometime after that the savings and loan failed. Dad had in the meantime withdrawn, had pointed out some of the problems that the savings and loan was going to have, and the state authorities were involved, and it was back in a time when it seemed like real estate and investments of that nature were not nearly as sure as they seem to be today. But I remember this man rushing over to see Dad and saying, you know, I brought my savings over here. Now the savings, it hadn't filled yet, but it had closed. Now it's closed. And Dad said, well, here's your check. I never deposited it. And several weeks, I think, had gone by. So Dad was actually taking a risk, but that's a true experience.
When I was, I don't know, 12, 13, or 14, we'd have the church farm, and we would have, we would clear out the weeds from the ditch bank at the church farm. And I remember this one time, we were cleaning out the weeds, and one by one, the other dads and sons and everything left, you know, until it was just us and the caretaker, you know. And I said, Dad, you know, everybody's leaving. And he says, well, that doesn't mean we have to leave now. We're staying until it's done, you know. And so we were kind of towards the end. And I remember the other thing is that we would, this is maybe younger, maybe, I don't know, maybe when I was 12, we would thin beets. And Dad would just go off so fast, you know, and he just had a tremendous ability to thin beets, and he knew how to do it, and he would just do it fast, and he just seemed like he loved it, you know. And he said that growing up, you know, he'd get so much for an acre or something, like a couple of dollars, you know, that he certainly knew how to thin beets.
Do you remember once that Mother said that she had never known Dad to do an unkind thing? That's probably going to be said more than once. But Dad had a real, almost some kind of an obstruction in his mind that would not let a mean or unkind or hurtful word come out. And I think this was a lifelong experience, probably developed over a lifetime, but many times, and I'm not talking now just about the last few months or years of his life, but I had a close association with him for 20 or 30 years there. Sometimes I could tell that the right thing to say, the kind of correct, straightforward thing to say in answer to a question or an inquiry that I was making, particularly maybe about a business transaction or something, would be to be critical of some party in it. That would be a more straightforward approach. For example, the man didn't pay what he owed, or the man didn't honor his obligation. Dad would never say that. You could not trick him into saying it. It was never anything that would disparage another individual, no matter what. That didn't mean he'd be dishonest. He would just stop and think long enough so that he could say it in some way that didn't disparage or be hurtful to another person. And that it was, I think, more than a practiced art. I think it was ingrained into his heart that he was not going to do this, such that he actually probably physically couldn't. You maybe knew this already,
really,
Julia.
No, that's, what do you attribute that to? I mean, what?
Well, I think a sense of goodness that had surrounded him all of his life. I think he had always felt secure. He never felt that anybody else had to be cut down for him to feel secure and good. And I think sometimes our criticisms is we're trying to point out that we're right so another person is wrong. I think Dad never had any of those types of insecurities.
And it was always the same, consistently and never critical, but understandable. Like I would say that be careful of this guy because he has a tendency to try to rip you off, something of that nature. And Dad wrote to Paul, he says, this man wants to buy one of our farms out in west of the town or something, someplace. And he said, now, we need to be aware of this because he'll probably want to execute a very good sale.
You know, I worked one summer up there for Delbert. Somehow they thought I could help in the office, and I don't think I was that good, but they tolerated me for the summer. I really appreciate that opportunity to work for your dad because it really, he always had an unusual ability to know how to approach and help people. And, you know, I can remember different, people coming in and talking to him. I remember one fellow coming in that was really upset about something and blustering and just sort of an overbearing type of fellow. And it's the only time I ever heard your dad raise his voice. And I thought, my mouth just fell open. I'd never ever seen your dad, upset or angry. And anyway, the fellow was quite meek after that. And they talked for a minute, and I don't know how long, and took care of whatever problem there was, and he left. And Delbert turned around and laughed, and he said, sometimes you just have to outdo them.
Through all of my adolescence, I frequently became ill. I'd be nauseated, have a headache, dizzy, terribly dizzy, and my mind would slow down, stop working right. My tongue would get numb, my fingers would. And all we did was I would go to bed, and Mom would bring me up a nice warm bowl of cream of mushroom soup. I never remember consulting a doctor. It went on for years and years. Mom said, when you get through with adolescence, it'll pass. But Mother went regularly because she was either pregnant or having a new baby just about all the time. And she went regularly to the doctor. And like I say, she took us for our immunizations.
Mother would say, you just do the natural thing.
Yeah,
And
the natural's the better.
The natural is always the better. Yeah.
What were some of her natural remedies?
cream and mushroom soup. But if we go clear till a lot later, when I was a single working girl and came home and asked Mom for an aspirin, she said, well, I have some up in the top cupboard in the kitchen, but I don't think you should take aspirin.
Yeah, I think she was worried about any kinds of pills.
When Dad was, I believe it was 1950. Dad was sick when he had the pancreatitis, and I was with David and I remember when if Dad had been in the hospital for some time, that her mother realized that it really was important. Remember, she just fainted or just laid right down on the floor, just like collapsed, and just wouldn't get up for a while. And then finally, she just get herself together and get up.
He took us fishing quite a bit, and I remember once we were going up to, I think, Max Inn or someplace fishing, and we got as far as like Rigby or Rexburg, and Grandpa was feeling kind of uncomfortable, and he stopped and said, I have to go in here for a minute. And it was a hospital that he went into, and we waited in the car for quite a while, and finally a doctor came out and said, your father is sick. And I think one of the boys, maybe David or John, was old enough they could drive, and they drove us home. But that was when Dad had somehow run into the edge of a car door and injured his kidneys. And while I didn't think much of it at the time, it turned out to be a very life-threatening injury. He was at home for a long time in the bed, and but I never heard him complain, even when it was so life-threatening, must have been so painful to us. He just said, can you just wait here in the car? I need to go into the hospital for a minute.
I remember one time we had gone up to Rick's to go to a musical thing, and the Provo thing can't come up. In fact, this was a time when Dad had said, well, Julia, what do you think? Are you glad that you didn't, or what do you think as you went away to school? And I again said, so grateful. And anyway, Mother refused to speak to us and would not go to the thing with us. And she just sat in the car. We went.
And of course, we all grew up with the lore about Provo being the center of learning and Idaho being kind of the backwoods. But, Mom turned out to love Idaho. She really had her, performed her mission here, and she understood that, and she felt that way. We had close associations with her clear to the end of her life also.
Well, I remember when I first came to Provo, I couldn't believe that we went to Idaho Falls because I thought Provo was so beautiful. One of the first things I wanted to do was hike up to the Y or go up to Timpanogos. But by then I was already a 16, 17-year-old. But growing up, I just remember that Idaho Falls was kind of a hick town for Mom. It wasn't the real place she wanted to be, and that we just had to be there for a while, and then eventually we'd go back and live where we should have been all the time, which was in Provo or Salt Lake. I wasn't ever sure which it was, but I knew it was someplace down here. So I was very aware of that conflict that she had.
I think really that was the only really major conflict was the Provo thing. And I think Mother had felt that he had promised her. And I don't really know the whole thing. But I remember at one time when there had been, several things that had really hurt the folks, that Grandpa said, he said to me, maybe we should have moved to Provo. And I just wanted to scream, don't you ever say that, No, it's, but he rolled with things, and really their relationship was beautiful. It's sort of nice, sort of comforting to have this one little glitch, isn't it? So you think, yeah, they really did have a human experience. It wasn't just, just this idealistic thing.
I just don't think there's anything more wonderful as I'm older and look and see what's real and what's not than the fact that they loved one another. And after they passed away and I went through their papers, I saw this started right when they first met.
Mm-hmm.
All through my life, and still do have the really strong admiration for Dad for feeling so much love for Mom, for just thinking that she was the most wonderful human being on the planet. I said, Mom isn't that great, but Dad always treated her as though she was like a jewel, a pearl, just a wonderful, wonderful woman.
There were a couple of things, and this was true throughout his life. There were a couple of things that he did not allow to be criticized. Of course, we all know one was Mother. That was the one thing that I received corporal punishment for as a young child. I was sitting around the dinner table and I said something critical of Mom, probably that I didn't like the food that was being cooked or something of that nature. But anyway, it was a criticism of Mother, and this is when I was small. And it turned out that I'm not sure if I was sitting right next to Dad, but I was close enough to him around our big dinner table there on 12th Street that before I could finish my criticism, Dad's hand reached out and grabbed my ear and twisted it so hard that I could not finish my statement. It hurt a lot.
He would always pretty much agree with whatever she wanted to do. And they had an interesting relationship. When I think back about Mom and Dad now, I think of a really vibrant, young couple. But I do remember, in the finances and going places and different things, they definitely had lots of disagreements, but they seemed to get away from us and hash it out and resolve it, because Mom was definitely a determined, opinionated woman. Very strong.
I think the most meaningful thing to me at this point in my life is their relationship with each other. I think that there was just never any question that they supported each other. I mean, kids try to play one against the other. You couldn't do that. You couldn't do that with Mom and Dad. They were united, and I really, really appreciated that, the fact that their relationship. And of course, I never thought of Mom as a wife growing up. I thought of her as my mom, of course, and but I've thought about that more recently. The fact that she was first and foremost a wife. I mean, they just had a wonderful relationship. They just supported each other. They complimented each other. They loved each other.
inevitably foul balls off or something, because we have home plate right near the fence between our yard. And we were, when we'd knock the balls in, we would be accused of trampling down her flowers. But I remember, this was probably when I was like 10 or 12. We had friends that went to Jackson Hole, and they had these bottle rockets and everything. And one 4th of July, or near 4th of July, we just stormed her house with bottle rockets, you know, to kind of get our even, because Dad would really get on us for trampling Mrs. Charlesworth's flowers.
I'd get a BB gun, and I would go up in our tree house in back of our house and shoot the windows out of the garage of Mrs. Charlesworth. Now, Mrs. Charlesworth is kind of a grumpy lady, and so we thought this was just fair payback. It seemed like he liked fishing quite a bit. He used to go fishing quite a bit, and you know, it's something that as he got older and we got older, we didn't think much about. But when I was young, Dad used to do all sorts of hunting and fishing. We had a 12-gauge shotgun, 20-gauge shotgun, and we would go out duck hunting and pheasant hunting, and we would wait, and we'd shoot the ducks and shoot the geese, and we were really happy if we could get them, and we'd bring them home, and Mom would say, be careful about the pellets, you're gonna have some gunshot in there, so we'd have to be careful how we ate them, and we'd have fish a lot, yeah.
Do you enjoy fishing?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that Dad, I don't know, I don't think he really enjoyed anything like that, you know, particularly.
Well, it's very possible that he didn't like it. Maybe he just did it to please other people. He would go with his Brunt relatives. He would take us. He would go with maybe friends in the Kiwanis Club. But he would go a lot hunting and fishing.
He told me once that Grandma Brunt, when he was probably 15 or 12, I don't know, somewhere in his teenage years, before she died, he said that she took him aside, and because they lived just right over here, and said, you know, one day there's going to be a temple right over here, and you're going to have something to do with it, and you better get prepared. And she says it's going to be a beautiful white temple. And apparently, she didn't tell him, but apparently she'd sort of seen it in vision. And so in the 30s, he just, after she died, just shortly after, what year did Grandma Brunt die? Probably mid-30s somewhere. And he just had this feeling that he ought to assemble this land, you know, get the ownership. Because during the Depression, land is the opposite of what it is today. Then it was considered an albatross because you had to pay taxes on it every year. And no one wanted land. They wanted something that would produce money, especially vacant lots. And all of this land was just kind of worthless sand dunes over here. But Dad felt that he should assemble it, so he got all the ownership, listed who owned it, who was back on their taxes, how much he could buy it for. He bought quite a few of the lots, not all of them, but most of them. And then President Grant announced that they were going to build a temple in Idaho, but he didn't say where. And the city fathers here in Idaho Falls, they knew it would be either Rexburg or Idaho Falls or Blackfoot or Pocatello, some of these places that were pretty strong LDS. And a lot of them weren't members of the church, but Dad was very active in Kiwanis, the Chamber of Commerce, and all of those type of civic things. And they got a committee and appointed Dad because he had expressed an interest to locate some land, and the city would buy it and offer it to the church free of charge if they would build a temple here. And so they said, but we've got to hurry because these other communities are working on it too. And Dad said, I've already got it done. I accept the assignment, and here's the land. Here's the place it ought to be. here's all the ownership. I've got this, buy this. And of course, they immediately contacted all those people because the President Grant had said they needed, I think, a minimum of 10 acres or something like that. And this came to about 10 or 11 acres. And so within just a few weeks, they went to Salt Lake and showed the picture and presented it. And the story goes that President Grant wanted to come up and look, and he came up and looked and said, that's where the temple will be. And the other communities hadn't even gotten their bids in, so to speak. And so I felt that Grandpa really had an extra sense about Idaho Falls and about the destiny. And
She was so happy. They came over to my home. This is when I was married, and my husband was there. It was a lovely time. We also had at least one little girl, I think 2. And they came over. They had been to Salt Lake, and they came over and asked us about what was going, how we'd been for a while and so on. And then one of them mentioned we just had an interview with Malin Heslop. Well, I said, oh, he's one of the editors at the Church News. How did you happen to do that? And Dad said, I thought you'd never ask. And then they told me they'd been called to be the temple president. They were so excited.
And we've said often that we think that call really made Mother
Happier than anything else.
Yeah, I think she was happier with that than anything that I ever remember. And also that she was happy to be in Idaho Falls.
I can remember sitting there and having the sun stream through the painted glass windows. It was our old Fifth Ward. And listening to her music, that was a real treat,
You played the violin,
Yeah.
and I played the flute, and she played the piano, and we would go to wedding receptions.
Yeah, and everything.
Lots of wedding receptions.
Yeah. And isn't that amazing that, with all we had to do, that
She loved it.
There was never any question. Of course she would. Of
She
course she'd
really
be there.
enjoyed it.
And she
Music.
She never made a mistake. We were talking about,
Yeah, she was good at
come
doing
listening
this.
to her play the organ. Never. She as far as I could tell, she was perfection.
I remember many of the musicians that I was both exposed to as a student and introduced to and told were good musicians and somebody that I should respect, and that most of them were either not members of the church or not good members of the church. The fact that they smoked or carried on or whatever did not, in my mother's mind, mean that they weren't to be respected for their abilities.
Isn't that interesting? You could be good friends with them, but you don't date their daughter.
And then she was definitely a person who would persevere with kids. She was not one who would give up on things like that, so she wouldn't let me give up. And then I think with Dad, he paid for all this. None of this came free. And he paid for all of it, and of course Mother never was a breadwinner, so they had their complementary roles.
Yeah.
And one couldn't have worked without the other.
They had different rooms, so you would go there and you would practice. I mean, they had different rooms with pianos, so there would be
2 floors.
Yeah, 2 floors. So Mr. and Mrs. Summers both taught, and Mrs. Summers did the beginners, and then when you got to a certain level and a certain maturity, so you could not be too scared of Mr. Summers, you would go to his, but he would listen in each of the rooms to see how well you were doing, he could so from outside.
So it was really supervised.
It was
practice.
supervised practice is what it was.
And they would go from room to room.
And I
And
remember,
then once a week you'd play.
and once a week
you'd have
we
to
would pass off
your
pieces. Right. But he would thump on the door sometimes. He'd say wrong fingering, and he was nearly blind. And it was amazing. I mean, he could tell without even looking. Wrong fingering, and and so he was listening. You knew.
If it was you or Beth, but when the Summers retired, and the last recital, that Dad stood up and would just say, all these years, we've got to, the children of God, the summer school music, into these recitals.
That's right. Yeah. I could croak like a frog. And so they called me Froggy. And I got teased a lot.
But also,
Teased a lot.
you'd make the music when they do the family orchestra or something. Then you would sit under the table.
Yeah, they would have me sit under the table.
And croak.
Yeah.
Like a drum beat. But it was a frog. But can you remember how it sounded? I mean, it was.
Well, see, I was just wondering if I could still do it. It wasn't that big a deal, I didn't think. Let's see.
But everyone can do it.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. That was it.
I know my Heavenly Father knows The storms that went my way oppose, but he can turn the clouds away and turn my darkness into day, and turn my darkness into day. He knows, my Father knows, he knows, I'm sure he knows, the storms that went my way oppose. He knows, my Father knows, he knows, I'm sure he knows. A dear friend of mine I hadn't seen for quite some time called on me, shook my hand so joyfully. Oh, it's so good to see you. But you know, right now, I can't remember your name. And I'm so sorry. Brother Corneliuson said, don't feel sorry. Right now, I can't remember it myself.
It was sort of a bonus. You know, we moved back to Idaho Falls because that's where the job was, but it really was a bonus to have the parents around, and that was something that I thought of consciously about the experience that our kids would have in their life, that just having that legacy and having that connection with mom and dad would be a good one. Well, I think it was a lot of you and everybody else that they were living for. They had purpose in their lives, and I wouldn't say they lived very healthy. I guess relatively so, in that they weren't in nursing homes. But you know, it wasn't anybody's decision except for theirs that they weren't in a nursing home. They just didn't want to be in a nursing home, and they were coherent enough to say that clearly. By the way, in reference to their coherency, Dad would speak for Mom a lot, and he would sense what she wanted, and he would tell us. Dad was always very, very clear in what he said. He may be a little slow about arriving at his decisions, but when he made his decisions, it was clear. But they took good care of themselves. They lived simply. You know, they were good sports. They ate bread and milk, and they had good life habits. When they wanted to go to sleep, they would just do it, and they took care of themselves. It was really a chapter of all of our lives that I think most of us didn't really anticipate. That is, that it would be that we would have a large section, a large time spent in our lives taking care of our parents, and I think that's something that we probably ought to prepare for better. And, you know, the generations ought to be aware of that that's just part of life. And if parents pass away quickly and easily, it's kind of the exception rather than the rule.
I want to say that in some ways, as I look back on my parents, they were at the same time exactly what you would expect everybody to be: upright, thoughtful, industrious people trying to do their part. And I think for that very reason they are so exceptional, that they just were that way. They just actually were that way all the time, clear to the very ends of their lives. And I think that it isn't any one particular marvelous business decision that Dad made, or contribution that he made, or whatever, but just an entire long life of being not trying to be great, but trying to be exactly what was expected of a good person to be. Just to be that way in every sense, at every moment. And I think Mother the same way. She maybe had a few more notions of greatness, I don't know, but again, just these are the things that are expected. This is what the brethren say in General Conference. We just do this, and it's expected of everyone. And I think that's what makes them so exceptional, that without any deviations at all that I know, they just lived that way. That's the way they wanted to be. That was their life.
So we're grateful to see you all and to say to all of you, we love you with all our hearts. We're so grateful you're here and we're so grateful that you're ours. Thanks very much. That was my 5 minutes.